So we are continuing in our learning on Franz Rosenzweig and the return to Judaism. We're now in this section where we are focusing on Rosenzweig's understanding his approach to Torah. So we looked at 2 weeks ago the question of what is the truth of Torah for Rosenzweig, which is not such a simple question. Nothing with Rosenzweig is a simple question or a simple answer. Last week we looked at the idea of heresy that is like faith, and that perhaps taking a heretical perspective to Torah is actually better than a believing one, because the heretical perspective actually opens up to you to the possibility of just discovering something new in Torah, whereas the orthodox perspective of Torah perhaps closes you off to actually having an encounter with God. And today we're going to get, these are all variations on similar themes, but what I want to focus on today is how the Torah speaks to and represents this idea of the I and the thou, right? This idea of the encounter between any two beings, and particularly, as we're going to see, between God and human beings, between God and the Jewish people. And to get at this, we're going to look at what might be called Rosenzweig's dialogical philosophy, right? The idea that there is no I without a thou, right? You can't be an I without being in relationship to others. And this idea sort of sounds obvious, or maybe not, but in a certain sense, it's very countercultural for our contemporary modern liberal mode, which places a real emphasis on the individual as being really an island unto themselves. So before we get to Rosenzweig, I want to work through a Hasidic text and a rabbinic text that I think are deeply Rosenzweigian, as you're going to see. But they get at this idea of the essential nature that to be human means being in relationship to others, and oftentimes in deep relationship to others. So the first text we're going to look at is a Hasidic text from the Or HaMeir, who is a student of the Maggid of Mezrich. And this particular text is a commentary on the Parsha from a couple of weeks ago, Parshat Bo, in which you have the end of the 10 plagues, and it specifically focuses on the plague of Choshech, of darkness. And what he offers here is a very interesting interpretation of the plague, one that does a close reading on it, but also clearly injects his own understanding. It's commenting on the verse from that Parsha. Moses raised his hand toward heaven, and there was a great darkness in all the land of Egypt, right? This is the way most of the plagues play out. Moshe or Aaron are the agents that initiate them. And in this case, Moshe raises his hands to the sky, and that is basically the signal that brings forth the plague of darkness. And what is the consequences of the plague of darkness? People did not see their brothers, and no person could rise from where he was seated. So there are two aspects of the plague of darkness. And again, we don't typically think about this because, we imagine we know what darkness is. Ironically, most of the plagues are hard for us to really grasp because we never encountered anything like that before, even if they are things that could potentially happen in nature. But darkness is something we know, right? Like you turn off the lights. If it's nighttime, it's dark, right? It's something you can experience, something we've all experienced. We've been in pitch black environments before. But the two things that Torah highlights are the plague of darkness is that people couldn't see other people, right? The dark was so thick that they couldn't even see somebody, presumably even if they were standing right next to them, sitting right next to them. They couldn't see them. And as a consequence, it seems, no person could rise up from where he was seated. So the darkness prevented people from seeing others, and it essentially created a state of paralysis. They couldn't see others, and therefore they couldn't move. And the sense here is that they were, everybody was sort of profoundly alone and isolated in the darkness. So that's the psukim. Now we want to look at what the Or HaMeir does with this, and what he'll emphasize is the necessity of our relationships. And darkness clearly being the symbolism for what it means when we're not in relationship. We can't see the other. We can't even move. So here's how he opens. He says, here we derive a moral teaching. People have eyes, yet they do not see the good qualities of the enlightened. So what he's pointing out here is that most people are narcissistic, right? They really only care about themselves, and they cannot see the other. And what they really can't see about the other are the good qualities in others around them. They're too busy justifying their own ways, whether good or ill. I mean, most of us are so wrapped up with ourselves and what we do and what we want that we really can't see people for who they are. And if we see them, it's really as a means to our ends. He says this keeps them from rising to a higher rung, right? If you're totally wrapped up in yourself, if you can't see other people, if you can't see the good in other people, then that prevents you from growing. Thus, I've explained the Mishnah and Avot. All my days I grew up among the sages to mean I was capable of growing, rising from one level to the next, not just standing still because I was among the sages. So the ordinary contrast those who can't see others, those who can't grow, with this teaching in Avot that said, because one grew amongst the sages, because one grew up in relationship to others, and not just others, but sages, people you could learn from, that's why one was able to grow. He says, I was able to see how small I was, not yet having learned a single one of my master's ways. Meaning, you grow up around people, and they're unique, and they're singular, and you realize you have what to learn from them, and that is what prods you to grow. And that's what prods you to be in relationship from them, to make them your teacher, and to ultimately learn from them. One who wants to attain a high rung needs to fulfill, I have learned from all my teachers. But if you want to grow, if you want to learn, you has to be done through the context of relation. As explained by the rabbis in the Gemara, I learned much from my teachers and more from my companions, but from my students most of all. Right? That again, everything we learn is in the context of relationship, whether it's from our teachers, from our friends, or from our students. This is especially true of all the good qualities each person can learn from a friend or companion, right? That there's a learning that we can do through the relationship with others that spurs us to real growth. And what's interesting, I'll just point out here, is that we have all sorts of relationships. We have all sorts of friendships. But if they're not really prodding us to grow in any way, those relationships, then it probably means those relationships are not relationships in which we really see and experience the other as something that's beyond sort of the narrow constraints in which we engage with people. Meaning it's probably just an instrumental relationship, or it's a relationship that's frozen into a very specific way of being, but it's not a relationship that allows the other to really have an impact on me, to move me, and for me to move them. Right, because those kinds of relationships are dynamic, and they ultimately push us. And again, most of our relationships aren't like this. Most of our relationships are instrumental, but the ones that do, and if we open ourselves up to people in that way, they can really, really, push us to grow. I mean, I'll put you on the spot, Murray, but I mean, one of the things they say about doctors is that you learn, again, from those unique relationships you have with those doctors who are masters and you can learn from, and you also learn from your patients. And I imagine your own experience, like the most significant things you probably learned from a patient, you probably learned from a teacher in some way, right? Like that's not insight you can get out of a book, I'm guessing. Maybe I'm projecting here, but is that accurate, you think?
Sure, I'm sure it is. So what I was thinking as you were going through this, I came across a philosopher. His name is Emmanuel Levinas. Are you familiar with him?
Yes, Levinas is very much influenced by Rosenzweig. You should know.
Right. Yes, I do know that, and it's really interesting because Levinas's philosophy has to do very much with the other, and the transcendence of the other, and the calls it the alterity of the other.
Exactly.
Sort of plays into this whole concept. In his point, he brings up a couple of interesting points. One has to do with this otherness of the other, the alterity of the other. It's transcendent, and in his description, it's infinite. It's infinite. It's sort of really interesting. And what comes with it is a recognition of the otherness of the other, the alterity of the other. He argues comes a responsibility. You have a responsibility to the other, which is, I think, really an important concept. And there was one other point.
I mean, that's excellent, Murray. And all of that comes directly from Rosenzweig. I haven't always emphasized that language because, some of the people who are learning with us, I don't know how philosophically they would grasp that. But for Rosenzweig, it is the alterity of the other, it's the otherness of the other, it's the singularity of the other, that is the call of revelation. So when we talk about what is it, you mentioned to me before, what does it mean to hear God's call? What it is that experience of otherness, either within the Torah or within the world.
Right.
And the possibility for Rosenzweig and for Levinas that otherness is even something real, it comes from the very idea of God, right? That there's that whatever makes God God has to at least be the otherness of God, right? Because if God is like everything else, then how is God God, right? So the very concept of otherness comes, from a philosophical perspective from God in the first place. Now, why then is there otherness in human beings? Because human beings are created in the image of God. And Rosenzweig is very clear about this, that the alterity of the human is a direct reflection of God's otherness, right? And that's why revelation for him, and we're going to focus on this today, right, is best manifested in the love relationship, because love is that profound relationship where the experience of the other just transforms like my world. And that's exactly what revelation is for Rosenzweig. So in the context of relationships, just to be clear, it's exactly what you're saying. When I say that relationships impact me and change me and move me and spur me to growth, it's not necessarily the content that other people have, right? It's the otherness of the other and the impact that it has on me. And this is significant because content you can theoretically get out of a book, right? Like it can't be knowledge per se, right? So it's something else. And that something else is the unique experience that we have of other people in the context of real relationships, where we have to be open to their otherness. There's no escaping it. And that call of their otherness on us is always transformative. It's also extraordinarily difficult. It's the part of the other that we want to get rid of, right? Levinas talks about how we want to kill. We want to kill the other when we see their face, which is the seat of their alterity, in part because their otherness imposes itself on us, right? We don't have mastery of the world when we experience the otherness, because it's saying, there's something here you can't understand, you can't control, right? So that's where the ethical dimension of it is. What Levinas doesn't emphasize as much, but Rosenzweig does, is that otherness isn't always ethics. I mean, in the way we often think about it, but the way otherness impacts us is multifaceted. And I think sometimes Levinas kind of loses that. He focuses so much on otherness as an ethical imperative, and it is, but it's complicated. It's not always so simply an ethical imperative. There are many times when we feel that call of the other, and like I said, we experience the call as violent, or we experience it as threatening, and therefore we need to get rid of it. So to get to a point where we can experience the ethical call of the other and respond to it is a very very complicated question. Let me keep going. But the way you described it is absolutely perfect. And if you start looking at or thinking about some of the stuff we've done, you'll see how it projects onto all that stuff. Exactly.
There was one.
He says, but our generation is filled with a lot of ignorant people who do not know their right from their left. Nevertheless, they burst forth to take God's name and glory for themselves, while seeking to insult others and to gain glory by deriding them. This leads to baseless hatred due to our many sins. Meaning, again, most people are wrapped up in themselves, and they don't know others. They can't know others. They're wrapped up in their own selfishness. They pursue their own selfishness, and that leads to anger and hatred and jealousy. And that's the way most of life is, right? For all of us, a lot of the time, right? So again, that's not the kind of space we want to be in. But the only way to break out of that is through a genuine relationship to the other. And then he concludes here. He says, "This is the great darkness in all the land of Egypt." Meaning the darkness is the inability to really know and see and have a relationship with the other. That's what the plague of darkness is. He said, it's being understood metaphorically here, right? Like the darkness that doesn't allow you to see the other and therefore paralyzes you, right? Like that's the metaphor of being wrapped up totally within the self. Where awareness is lacking, there is great darkness. You then fall into the narrow places. That's what Mitzrayim is. Egypt means narrow places. But scripture then tells us what this darkness is. People did not see their brothers. See means they didn't consider them. Like they weren't living realities for them. They didn't take to heart how much they could learn from the goodness of the people around them. They couldn't see what was in them that was unique and how that could potentially impact the self. On the contrary, they kept finding fault and lack in others. Meaning the challenge here, this would be Levinasian here, right? To not see the other means to not be able to see the alterity, the otherness, the uncanniness, the singularity of the other. And all you see in them are faults, because that's what you project onto them, right? That there's something lacking, there's something lesser than. But that means you're not actually able to encounter the uniqueness of what they are. This led them to walk about in darkness, to not see the light. People like that cannot progress from one rung to the next. No person could rise from where he was seated. They stood about rather than walking forward, as a Jew is always supposed to do. Right? To be wrapped up within the self, to not have a relationship with others, is an experience of paralysis, and it's why people who are narcissists act like children, right? Like they never grow up because they never really have the opportunity to be in relationships with others in ways that spur them to to grow. And again, this is an example that's very common for Rosenzweig, but love. Right, love relationships. Nothing has forced me to grow more, and often in very challenging ways, than the relationship with my wife and the relationship with my children. My love for them, their love for me, the way their otherness challenges me and impacts me all the time, is the greatest spur for growth or change that I could ever have. And that's what it means to be alive, is to be alive to those relationships, of those who impact us so deeply here. So that's the Or HaMeir, and I think it captures very nicely all of these dynamics. And what I want to, we'll read these quotes in just a second, but what I want to highlight is this idea of how we as human beings are dependent on the other and become who we are in relationship to the other. In many ways, these are countercultural because we live in a time of, where the individual is sacrosanct. And this is a general, ideology of modernity, right, that places the emphasis on the individual, and that the individual has, freedom, the individual has rights, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like it's a good and it's a moral thing that we affirm the freedom of the individual and the rights of the individual. But there's a way in which we often take it so far that we absolutely become blind to the fact that we are not islands unto ourselves, right? As we saw in the previous text, right? Who we are as human beings and any kind of moral growth that possibly can exist for us comes through the context of our relationships. And in modern life, right, in many ways, the ideology is the lone rugged individual, right? Like the entrepreneur who will build the company out of nothing, or the Robinson Crusoe that lives on the island by himself and makes a life for himself. And modern individualism has this language of what they call the sovereign self. Right, the individual has to be sovereign, and you see this in a lot of political debates today, and that's why I brought the quotes here from Ayn Rand. Right, libertarianism is founded on the belief that the individual is sovereign. Right, nobody can tell me what to do. If the government exists, it's to put minimal constraints on the individual, but really the individual should be as free as possible because that's the right thing to do. That's the moral good. And I'll just give you these two quotes from Rand, who I thoroughly dislike, but they do capture the way a lot of people think, especially in America. And a lot of the debates about the vaccine mandates, all run around this sense that nobody should be able to tell me what to do, right? Like that's the fundamental, and it's deeply American, right? Like this goes back to the revolution. I mean, it's not just like a contemporary thing in the last few years, right? This idea of the individual who is sovereign is a deeply American idea. America is really the truly modern country. We embody modern, the ethos of modernity more than just about anywhere else, for better and for worse. So here's what she says: individualism regards every man, as an independent sovereign entity who possesses an inalienable right to his own life, a right derived from his being, his nature as a rational being. Right? This idea of we are a sovereign entity. Right? In political theory, the only things that are sovereign are like countries, right? You have to have authority rests within sovereign entities, right? That's usually what we say to be the state. So when we say the individual is sovereign, it's like every individual is their own state. Every individual has the right to issue their own laws for themselves. Like that's the language that's being used here. And there's some truth to that. We want people to be free. But like sovereign almost implies like everybody's like a god. Like everybody should be able to decide, for themselves exactly what they want. She continues, individualism holds that a civilized society or any form of association, cooperation, or peaceful coexistence among men can be achieved only on the basis of recognition of individual rights, and that a group as such has no rights other than the individual rights of its members. Meaning this kind of individualism sees only the individual, right? Society is a collection of individuals, right? There's no such thing as a group identity because there is no such thing as groups. It's just a collection of individuals. The individual is sovereign. To the extent the state has power, it's because we individuals as sovereigns have collectively gotten together and created a social contract where we're willing to sacrifice some of our freedom to get some protection from the government. That's the myth. And just another example where she says it even more strongly about like we don't need anybody, nobody should be in. I don't need anybody, nobody needs me. Here's what she says: an individualist is a man who says, "I will not run anyone's life, nor let anyone run mine. I will not rule nor be ruled. I will not be a master nor a slave. I will not sacrifice myself to anyone, nor sacrifice anyone to myself." Now, this quote here, it's about as close as you will get to saying, like, I as a human being don't need anybody, and nobody should have to need me. Right? Like I'm an island. Like I don't need anybody. They don't need need me. And the problem with this, well, there's many problems with this, but especially the second quote, it's just simply not true. Like if you've ever been married, if you've ever been a parent, there are times in which you are the master and there are times in which you are a slave. Like there's just no escaping that. And anybody who thinks otherwise doesn't understand what relationships are about. Right? All relationships have elements of mastery and slavery within them. It's not what we want to be at all times, but that we can't escape those power dynamics. Relationships all have power dynamics. And again, right, the way she talks here, it makes it seem like the only person who could say this is the person that doesn't love anyone and a person who's not in a relationship with anyone. But if you're going to open yourself up to others, right, there's going to be times where you're going to rule and be ruled and be a master and be a slave, and you're going to have to make sacrifices to others, and others are going to make sacrifices to you. These are all what it means to be in a relationship. It's all what it means to be human. So when she says that we don't need these things, it just fundamentally ignores who we are. Like, no, let me put it this way. Human beings did not come into this world as fully formed rational adults, right? We came into this world as helpless infants. Right? Nobody birthed themselves. Everybody in this world had a mother, right? And a father, presumably too, but we don't always know who the father is. You had a mother, right? You could not come into this world without a mother, which means you did not create yourself. You're not the Baron of Munchausen who pulls himself out of the mud by his own britches. Like we all are dependent on others. We are all brought into this world by others. And the other thing I'll say too, right? One of the things that Freud points out is that what makes humans unique is the extended period of time for which we are basically helpless. That human childhood and infancy lasts for much longer than it does for other mammals, which means we spend a very large portion of our life fundamentally dependent on others, right? Basically, the first 18 years of our lives in modern America, right? We are dependent on others. So this, and it's sort of like this myth, right? Somehow we turn 18, it's like we become this rational individualist that Anne Ryan describes here. So something magical happens and suddenly like we're free individuals. Well, guess what? Like for most of the early parts of our lives, we are deeply, deeply enmeshed with and dependent with others. So this notion that we could suddenly like hit a switch and magically become these free, rational, sovereign individuals is just, again, like, somewhat delusional. And then the last point I'll make is that all you had to do was see during the pandemic. Right? One of the things the pandemic did, if we were willing to open our eyes, was force us to recognize the way in which we are bound to others and connected to others in ways that were often invisible to us beforehand, but in which the pandemic forced us to recognize. So just the simple fact that transmissibility of the disease was by being around people, right? Like you are connected to people. What you do impacts others. What they do impacts you through their mere physical presence, sometimes in very serious and dangerous ways. Like we are connected to others. And on a societal level, even more so. I remember during the early days of the pandemic, when it was really unclear, how society was going to function as things were like being completely shut down. And it was like a big deal that Israel was still doing grocery deliveries because we were much more shut down than in America. And I remember the Palestinian workers who are the delivery guys for the supermarket coming to drop the food off those first couple of weeks and just like realizing like my life's dependent on them, like that my life, my physical well-being, my sustenance is dependent on others who you can't always even see or you don't always see because you're so wrapped up in yourself. It's like darkness for you. That I am deeply connected to them. And like the whole idea of essential workers, which was a bad term, but what it was trying to get at is that we as individuals are not really individuals. Like there's a whole network of people who we are bound to, who are supporting us, and hopefully we are, supporting them. So this idea of the sovereign individual is a myth, like most ideas, and it has its place, but it can become emphasized to such a degree that it puts us in a darkness, right? That's the problem with this, in this sense of individualism. It puts us in a darkness. It takes us out of relationship with others. Any thoughts or questions, Mary, before I go on?
No, not yet.
Okay. So I want to look at one more text that gets us at the way in which we are connected to others and that our selfhood is defined by our relationships to others. And that is a rabbinic text from the Gemara and Masechet Brachot. So what the subtext for this, or maybe even not the subtext, the framing for this Gemara is in a broader discussion about the meaning of suffering. And why is it that the righteous suffer in this world? And this is obviously a major topic in rabbinic thought and in the Talmud in many places. And there are a whole assortment of answers that are provided as to why is it that the righteous suffer. Because the presumption is if we can come up with a reason, if we can come up with a meaning to help make sense of it, then the suffering isn't as bad, right? It still hurts, but at least now there's a reason for the pain. So that many answers are offered in different places. What introduces this story is an idea called Yisurin Shel Ahava, suffering of love. And what's interesting about it is that it's sort of like, you might say, the last ditch attempt of the rabbis to explain suffering, because what it proposes is that for certain people who are righteous and they're experiencing suffering, there is no reason for it, that they deserve it in any way whatsoever. These kinds of sufferings, at least for the truly righteous, are called sufferings of love, because God sends these sufferings to purify the individual. Meaning even the righteous have some sins, so God sends them suffering in this world so they can be cleansed of their sins, so that when they enter into the next world, they'll be completely pure, right? So that's the idea that sits behind this, as a way of making sense of why the righteous suffer. They don't really deserve it, but it will cleanse them of the small sins that they have, so they can enter into the next world pure. So here's how the story goes. Rabbi Chia bar Abba, stories about rabbis getting sick and being visited by other rabbis. Rabbi Chia bar Abba fell ill, and Rabbi Yochanan went to visit him. One rabbi fell ill, Rabbi Yochanan goes to do Bikur Cholim, right? That's the mitzvah. You visit the sick. And I think we don't always know why we visit the sick. This gets at it. And again, as a doctor, Murray, this may be obvious to you, but I think it's, for a lot of us, it's not always so clear. When Rabbi Yochanan goes to visit Rabbi Chia bar Abba, he says, "Are your sufferings welcome to you?" Meaning, are these sufferings that you experience, do you accept them? And Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, neither they nor their reward. Which Rabbi Chia bar Abba is saying to Rabbi Yochanan is that if these are Yisurin Shel Ahava, sufferings of love, sufferings I don't deserve but are purifying, he says, I don't want them. I reject that as a reason for these sufferings. And we'll unpack what that means. So what does Rabbi Yochanan do? He reaches out his hand. He says, give me your hand. He gives him his hand and he lifts him up. Again, the presumption being that Rabbi Chia bar Abba was either sitting or lying in bed, again, in pain or something like that. But Rabbi Yochanan comes and he reaches in. He doesn't want the sufferings. And Rabbi Yochanan comes and reaches him and lifts him up. And then we see the story now. Rabbi Yochanan gets sick. Rabbi Yochanan once fell ill. And Rabbi Hanina went in to visit him. And he said to him, are your sufferings welcome to you? Meaning, are these Yisurin Shel Ahava, sufferings of love? Do you want that? Accept them as that way? And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, I don't, neither they nor their reward. So what does Rabbi Hanina do? He says to him, give me your hand. And he gives him his hand. He raises him up, right? Basically, it's now in reverse. It's a different rabbi with Rabbi Yochanan, but it's the situation in reverse. Before, Rabbi Yochanan was the one who came to visit. Now Rabbi Yochanan is the one who is being visited. Why could not Rabbi Yochanan raise himself? Why couldn't he get up in his pain? And they replied, the Gemara says, the prisoner cannot free himself from jail. And this is a really fascinating point, right? We cannot escape our own suffering by ourselves, right? We need the presence of somebody else to help lift us out of our pain and our suffering. So again, I want to just unpack this whole piece here real quick. So as I said before, if they were willing to accept these were sufferings of love, then that would mean that the pain and the suffering wasn't meaningless. But when they rejected their sufferings of love, what they're saying is this is meaningless suffering. There's no good reason for it, and it's destroying them, because that's what meaningless suffering does, right? It destroys the individual. And again, if you've seen, Murray, you've seen this more than I have, but I unfortunately had to watch enough congregants go through terminal cancer to know what Yisurin, meaningless suffering is, right? Because at a certain point, however you try to understand cancer, at a certain point, it's just so destroys the individual and becomes so excessive that there's just no meaning to be had there. And when you reach that point, it is just profoundly terrible. There's nothing more difficult. There's nothing that more eviscerates our sense of self. And what the Gemara is saying is the only thing that can get you out of that place where there's just total meaningless suffering and pain is the presence of somebody else, right? That other who can come and literally help you out of it. It's the presence of the context of the story of their friends. They come and they literally help them off the ground. In the absence of meaning, it's the presence of others that bring meaning to our lives. And again, we all know this. I mean, the Gemara doesn't say it here, but this is what Avelis is, right? When you lose a loved one, right? You spend 7 days sitting in your house by yourself. There's a sense of pain. There's a sense of suffering. When you lose a loved one who you're close to, there's no way to make sense of that or find meaning in it. There's just an emptiness and an absence to it that can be overwhelming. And what people come is they come and they come to bring their presence and their relationship. And by virtue of that, they are able to help you at least some of the way get your self out of it. And again, it's not the words they say; it's their their presence at the end of the day. That relationship, that encounter, right? That experience of their otherness, their presence with you, that does something real. And in the next part of the rabbinic text, I'm not going to read this out loud. It's another story. Rabbi Elazar is sick now, and Rabbi Yochanan goes to visit him. And again, you can see how they get sick and they keep visiting each other, because once you've been in this position, right, you understand what it means to potentially be there for the other. And in this story, when Rabbi Yochanan goes to visit Rabbi Elazar, he sees him lying in a dark room, right? So I think that's interesting to me, because what is Rabbi Elazar? He's all alone, lying down in the darkness, which is exactly the metaphor we saw going back to the Or HaMeir and the Torah itself, right? To be alone means to be in darkness. It means to be unable to see others, and it means to be in a state of paralysis. And it's the presence of others that helps us, helps bring us out of that. That literally lifts us up out of that. Now, I'm going to go on to Rosenzweig in a moment. But do you want to add anything, Murray, or any questions?
No, no, I think, it's clear that that Ayn Rand's concepts are interesting, but they have no real merit. And the other interesting thing is that the Talmud, in its way, offers up the real truth.
Yeah. And look, as a doctor who's been with countless patients, you know that there's something about the person-to-person encounter in the hospital that means more than any words they're saying, or what information you can get off the chart, or what words you can offer them, or whatever prescription you can give them, right? There's something fundamental about the encounter that is I don't want to say it's as or more meaningful, because I don't want to diminish medicine, but it's its own serious, real thing that has to be recognized as fundamental to who we are. So Rosenzweig's deeply aware of these kind of
reality. In fact, reality is that I think real human beings themselves understand this concept, and unfortunately, from time to time, doctors forget. Yeah.
Well, it's medicine has shifted quite a bit, but it used to be, the patient, the doctor was the expert. The patient was kind of like, an object of analysis, but not a human being. And it was, the doctor's job to prescribe, and it was the patient's job to be subservient and listen. And there wasn't a lot of humanity in that encounter. Medicine's actually come a long way, because they now recognize that all those things about a person that can't be put on a medical chart, go equally as much as important to who they are, their well-being and their health, as any, detail you can get off a test. So medicine is shift, but in general, the way medicine works is by turning patients and even doctors. Again, the dehumanization is not just patients, it's doctors too now, right? Like everybody's just cogs in a wheel. It's a mechanistic enterprise, right? See as many patients as you can, formulaic treatments. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but on the one hand, it's gotten worse. On the other hand, there's a deeper awareness of how problematic that fundamentally is. But I want to make a point here too. It's not just philosophical or theological. Like, it's a basic human truth. Like, we cannot live without others, and our relationships to others are just so fundamental. It's not like a fluffy idea. It's just like, it's just, as Rosenzweig would say, like, this is like common sense. This is the way he describes it. Like, this is common sense. This isn't like, something that's some esoteric thinking, and it should be therefore fundamental to how we view the world and deter and draw up our way of being in the world. So Rosenzweig's very much aware of these dynamics, and in the text we're going to look at from him, he actually echoes, I think, intentionally or unintentionally, the Gemara that we just saw. I don't know, he didn't know a lot of Gemaras, so it's hard to know if he was drawing on it, but it's similar in ways that I think are very, very important. And what he opens this text with is a criticism of philosophical idealism. And idealism, German idealism in particular, is a very important stream of philosophy in the 19th and mostly the 19th century. Kant and Hegel and Fichte and Schelling, a whole series of very, very important German thinkers who still are very influential. Were very influential for Rosenzweig in a lot of ways too. But idealism, it refers to them, but it's philosophy in general. And we can even make the application to medicine as well, right? It imagines you can look out at the world and develop a sense of systematic knowledge, right? Every piece of the world can be carved up and divided and put in its proper box, and you can show how it all fits together, right? That's the way idealism imagined the world. And again, this is the way math and science often function in general. But it was a way, again, of looking at the world in which you can put everything in its box and have a conceptual framework that ties everything fundamentally together. But the problem with idealism, and it's the same, in a certain sense, the same problem that exists with liberalism, is that it forgets that life cannot be a closed system, right? Just like life is not the individual and that's it, so too life isn't this systematic knowledge that can be, anything that can be plugged into, right? And again, like, you can imagine idealism, if we're going to sort of make the extrapolation to like medicine for a moment, or a bad example of it, right? It's the doctor that's like the super scientist and the super analyst. But like, all they can look at is like the technical details. Like, they can't see that there's always more to a human being than the technical details. And even the best systematic knowledge, like, will always discover that there's things about being human that can't fit in those boxes.
Right.
Because to be human is basically to exceed all categories. Because as we said before, human being is created in the image of God, right? There are dimensions of us. There's an otherness to who we are that exceeds the ability to put human beings in boxes. So idealism attempts to put a human being in a box, and it always, ultimately fails to do so. And again, it's not just idealism. Anybody who claims that they've got human beings figured out and the world figured out, right, like, are people you should be very, very, wary of. Because, as I said, to be human means to exceed all answers and to exceed all systems. And that's why our relationships with others mean so much to us. That's why human beings mean so much to us, because who they are exceeds words, right? The very fact that human beings exceed words, there's not enough words for me to describe what my wife means to me. There just isn't. Means that human beings can't be put into boxes. And that's what makes human beings so powerful. Like, that's what makes them the most powerful force on us in the world. So here's what Rosenzweig says. He says, idealism is not at all superstition, right? Don't think philosophy and this kind of thinking is like some, superstition. Rather, it is a specific pathological phenomenon, schizophrenia or self-pleasuring. And I'll be more crass for a moment. And the actual translation is masturbation, right? Because in a sense, the idealist, like, is able to, like, almost kind of like the narcissist, but in a different way. Narcissists can't see anything outside themselves. The idealist has their system, but what that means is that they're so enamored with their system that everything fits into their system, right? There's no ability for anything to be other, to be something else, right? To be something that can't fit in the system. And that's why the idealist is also somebody who, again, is kind of like a narcissist in the sense the other doesn't exist for them. Because when you got your system, everything can plug in the system, then everybody is sort of in your framework under your control. And he says a person is able in practice to educate himself, to redeem himself, right? So in theory, you can educate yourself. You can open up books and read and learn, and you can redeem yourself on your own, right? In a sense. However, he is able to do this only at the cost of his complete humanity. Right? Remember, the Gemara said, you cannot redeem yourself. Right? The prisoner cannot redeem themselves from prison. We as human beings can't redeem ourselves. We need others. And that's exactly Rosenzweig's point. You may think you can educate yourself and grow, like we saw in the Or. You may think you can redeem yourself and transform yourself, but whatever you're doing is actually at the cost of your humanity. Because to do those things fundamentally have to be in relationship to others. Because it's the otherness of the other that forces us to grow and learn and forces us to be able to change. He says, in order to remain whole, the I needs its you. Meaning if you want to be a whole person, if you want to be an I, there always has to be a you. And idealism, individualism, right? All these things are a way of pushing away the you of the other. One is unable to rid themselves of a headache on their own by placing their hand upon their head. Rather, they are in need of the hand of their beloved, the hand to which they can be drawn into without remainder. Right? I love this line because it's so true. Right? When you're a child and some part of your body is hurting you, you fell down, you bumped your head, you immediately run to your mother or your father, and you want them to, place their hand on it, to kiss it. And in the moment when they do that, like your pain is taken away, right, by that experience of being, connected to and enveloped, by the other. As Rosenzweig goes on, he says, within his own hand, one cannot be drawn into without remainder. For what remains at least is the hand. Meaning if my head's hurting and I put my hand on my head, I never get out of myself, right? But when my beloved puts their hand on me, it's something different. It's not me. And that changes everything potentially. And that's Rosenzweig's point. And this goes exactly, echoing the Gemara, right? When those rabbis went to visit the rabbis who were in pain and suffering, who were in darkness, were all alone, right? It's the act of reaching out the hand, right, to lift them up. It's not even the physical presence, right? That is the experience of the other, but the real experience of the other is when they put their, press their hand into mine. And that's what enables me to break out of who I was before, because I wasn't an I before. I was this narcissistic whatever. When they reach out their hand, there's a you and I'm an I, and something real can finally change for me. So you can see, Rosenzweig is echoing the themes of both of those texts in a very deep way, and it goes to the whole heart of his thought. Dialogical thought is about the encounter with the other and the otherness of the other. Right? It's not just that I meet a person on the street, I learn their name, I learn where they're from, and I find out who their friends are and what they do, and I can incorporate this knowledge and who this person is into my life. No, when I encounter the other, there is something about them that eludes language, that eludes knowledge, that draws me in, but also repels me, that draws me in and also compels me. And that is what changes me. That is what propels me to look at myself and the world in a fundamentally different way. I'm not a real I unless I open myself up to the otherness of the other. And this idea is again central for Rosenzweig. It's central for Martin Buber. And on this point, Martin Buber and Rosenzweig were in agreement, though there are differences about the way that they conceive the I thou. But I wanted to bring just a quote from Buber about I thou because I do think Rosenzweig would more or less agree with this. Buber says the basic word I, you can be spoken only with one's whole being, right? When you say I, you are speaking to the other with like the fullness of who you are. The concentration and fusion into a whole being can never be accomplished by me, can never be accomplished without me, meaning it's I, you that makes me an I, meaning I can't be an I without a relationship to the other. So I have to be there and the other has to be there, right? There's no escaping that. I require a you to becoming I. If I want to become an I require a you, I require a real relationship. I say you. All life is encounter, right? Now, I think where Rosenzweig and Buber disagree is that Buber thinks the possibility for a real encounter is like anywhere, anytime. Rosenzweig is a little bit less sanguine about that. Rosenzweig believes that the kinds of I thou encounters that are really transformative to us are rather few and far between. Because for Rosenzweig, the ideal I thou encounter is the falling in love. And the number of like true love relationships that we have in our life we probably count on, one hand, or something like that. So, but Rosenzweig Rosenzweig believes the possibility for encounter could be anytime, anywhere. But Buber sees it happening quite a bit potentially. For Rosenzweig, it's rare, but when it does happen, it means everything to us. And we're not a human being unless we're really open to those encounters. And as in my own experience, like it's my relationship with my wife and our marriage that has fundamentally made me who I am, and in ways that I can't even put into words. And I know that, and I feel that with every fiber of my being. So I want to play up a little bit more in the time that we have about how Rosenzweig understands this I-thou experience, this encounter, this necessity, and how it relates to revelation in the context of the Torah. So for Rosenzweig, the I-thou moment of revelation, as I said, is the moment of falling in love. And we've talked about this before, but it basically reflects this idea of God's calling to us and us being able to sort of answer God's call. Again, we're not necessarily talking about words here, but that's the way we sort of intuitively experience it. And when you look in the Torah, right, this is a repeated theme, right? This idea of God's call and the human response, right? The first example of it is in Parshat Bereshit, where God calls out to Adam after the sin, Ayeka, where are you? Obviously wanting Adam to respond, meaning God knows where Adam is. He doesn't need to ask where Adam is. So when God asks, where are you to Adam, it's an invitation to relationship. It's an invitation for Adam to respond, presumably to respond and take responsibility. But of course, that's not what Adam does. Adam hides and he doesn't answer God's call, and he ends up, having to confront God anyway, but ultimately being punished for it. And Rosenzweig points out that God's call of Ayeka, where are you, is ultimately answered not by Adam, but by Avraham, right? We know that God calls out to Avraham, Lech Lecha, right? Avraham has to leave his homeland. Avraham has to go to the land of Israel with Sarah, basically to transform their lives, to make a new life for themselves in the promised land. And the answer that Avraham ultimately gives to God, though not by Lech Lecha, but later on, is this answer of Hineni, here I am, which for Rosenzweig is the answer of the response, right? So if we think about an I and thou, the way Rosenzweig understands it at least, is that when the other calls to me, when God calls to us, God says you, right? And when we respond, we say I, right? Like that's basically the way it's supposed to be, understood. When God says you, that's the proper name, like God's calling our name. And when we say I, that's us saying, here I am, we're ready to be in relationship. We answer the call, doesn't just mean like, yeah, I'm here. It means like, no, like you called to something deep in me, and now I am responding to it. That's why Levinas sees it as an ethical call, because the ethical call is that call to take responsibility for when I say here I am to the other, it means I'm saying I'm responsible to you and your desires and your needs and your suffering in one form or another. Right? If we want to read those Gemaras like in a Levinasian way, right? When those rabbis know that their friends are at home suffering, right? Like that's what they experience as the call of the other, right? They don't even have to see them essentially, just that they're their friends and they know they're suffering, right? And it's the going there, which isn't easy to go to visit somebody who's sick and ill and at home, and especially if you don't know you can do anything about it. You can go, you may not cheer them up, right? But they are still willing to take responsibility for the suffering of the other by going and ultimately, offering their hand to them, right? That's what the Hineni, that's the ethical response. So for Rosenzweig, right? Starts with Adam. Adam doesn't respond. Continues with Avraham. Avraham says yes, right? That is the moment God falls in love with Avraham. God falls in love with Avraham's descendants, the Jewish people. And when you look throughout the Torah, again, this paradigm of God calling out and human beings responding is all over the place, right? God calls out to Moshe at the burning bush. Moshe responds, Hineni. God calls out to Shmuel much later on. Shmuel responds, with Hineni. So this theme is all over the place. And if you think about just the basic paradigms of Jewish life, right? The two things that Jews do probably most, Torah and Tefillah, right? We study Torah and we pray, right? Those are maybe the two biggest, mitzvot that orient our lives. Well, again, the experience of studying Torah, reading Torah, is the experience of hearing God's call to us, and tefillah is the act of turning towards God. Right, so this idea again, call and response, it's all over the place within Jewish life. Even our prayer itself is often structured call and response, right? The Devarim Shebekadusha, right? Like Baruch Hu or Kaddish, right? What makes those prayers what they are is the prayer leader leads specifically as an invocation for the Kahal to respond, right? So call and response again is deeply fundamental here. And for of the experience of relationship and really of revelation, of falling in love, right? I fall in love with the other, and I'm willing to say hineni to that love. So the aspect of Tanakh, of Torah, that most represents this is Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, right? The love song. And what Rosenzweig will actually point out is that no book of the Tanakh is framed more around I and you than Shir HaShirim, because it's a dialogue between the lover and his beloved, where each one is basically calling out to the other and responding to the other. So this idea of I and thou and love and relationship is like fundamental to Shir HaShirim. And what's fascinating is that if Shir HaShirim represents the heart of revelation, and the Torah is supposed to be this record of revelation, well, this idea is very much reflected within, again, rabbinic thought and as a whole. The Mishnah Masechet Yadayim has this whole debate about the status of Shir HaShirim. And there's an implication that Shir HaShirim shouldn't be part of Tanakh because it's like love poetry and maybe even somewhat inappropriate love poetry. How could it be part of the books of the Bible? How could it be a book of revelation? And what the Mishnah points out is that, yes, Shir HaShirim is part of Tanakh, and it's Rabbi Kiva himself who says this. Rabbi Kiva said, far be it. Nobody ever disputed that Shir HaShirim was part of Tanakh. Everybody knows it's really part of Tanakh, which of course they didn't because they're having a debate about it. But he says the whole world was not as worthy as the day when Shir HaShirim was given to the Jewish people, right? The ultimate day of revelation, the ultimate day which made the world worth living in, was the day in which Shir HaShirim came into being. For all the writings are holy, but Shir HaShirim is the Kodesh HaKodashim, right? Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, the metaphor of revelation, of the I, thou, of falling in love, is at the heart of what it means to be a Jew and what it means and what Torah is fundamentally about. Because it's the Kodesh HaKadoshim, presumably of the Tanakh, right? Is Shir HaShirim. It's the very, like the living, beating, holy heart of Torah. And what's fascinating is that if you're aware of this week's Parsha Truma, right? What do we find the Kodesh HaKodashim of the Mishkan, right? That's what the Parsha is all about, the Mishkan, what it looks like, what's inside of it. So the Parsha tells us that in the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, you find the Aron HaKodesh, right? The Ark of the Covenant. And inside the Ark are the Luchot, right? The tablets. And what's on top of the Ark are the Kruvim, right? These cherubim, right? These angelic figures. And what the Torah describes very clearly is how on top of the ark are these two angelic figures that face each other in relationship, right? I'll just read the verses in English real quick. Make two cherubim of gold, make them of hammered work at the two ends of the cover of the ark. Make one cherub at one end and the other cherub at the other end. So there's two cherubim, each on one end of the ark. Of one piece with the cover shall you make the cherubim on both ends, meaning that the cover and the cherubim are all one piece of gold. The Kruvim shall have their wings spread out above, shielding the cover with their wings. They shall face each other. The faces of the Kruvim being turned towards the cover. So you have the Kruvim with their arms extended, facing towards each other. And in the rabbinic understanding, when we say they spread their wings, it's actually like towards each other. It's actually in like an embrace. So in the literal Kodesh HaKodashim of the Mishkan, right, what you have is the metaphor of the I and the thou, right? Like that's exactly what's being described here by the Kruvim, the face-to-face, which is very significant for Levinas and also very significant for Rosenzweig. That is the moment of it. It's the metaphor we use for encounter, because you don't really ever notice somebody until you look at them in the face and experience them face-to-face. And there's always something uncanny about looking at somebody really like in their face, in their eyes. If you really try to look at somebody in the eyes, it's like somewhat uncomfortable because it means confronting the dimensions about them that, again, exceed our ability to understand or to grasp or to have control over. So that face-to-face encounter of I and thou, of revelation, of love, is symbolized in Shir HaShirim, but it's also literally in the Holy of Holies of the Mishkan itself. So when Rosenzweig sees Shir HaShirim as love and revelation and as the heart of Torah, whether he knows it or not, he is drawing deeply on these rabbinic themes here. And again, this idea that the Jewish people and God are in this I-thou relationship is embedded throughout rabbinic literature, even without that language. But this idea of this fundamental relationship that binds the two to each other and defines each other is essential. I'll just point out here in Shir HaShirim, if you look at it, so this is the first chapter of Song of Songs, and I just tried to highlight every place where it says I or you. And again, you'll see that it's all about, you, I. Oh, give me the kisses of your mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. Your ointments yield a sweet fragrance. Your name is like the finest oil. Therefore do maidens love you. Draw me after you. Let us run. I am dark but comely. Don't stare at me because I am swarthy. My own vineyard I did not guard, right? So again, it's this constant dialogue of you, I. Again, that's what revelation is that relationship that fundamentally connects us to the other and ultimately binds us to them. So this is the heart of revelation. This is the heart of Torah. But I do want to point one thing else out, because one thing that Rosenzweig emphasizes again and again is that there's something about the experience of love that is ephemeral, that is past. It's both eternity, but also like passes in an instant, right? It's both like outside of time, and therefore the experience of love feels like it's forever, but there's something about it which it like you blink an eye and it's gone. And so if we are trying to put love into something that is more permanent, that is something that is very challenging, right? The I-thou relationship really orbits around a particular moment, right? Like there's some moment in which, whether I even realize it or not, I have now been impacted by and in relation to the other, or vice versa. But the challenge is how do we build that moment into something more permanent, into a deeper recognition? Meaning, going back to what we said before, most people don't recognize the dialogical dimension, the relational dimension of what it means to be human, that others make us who we are, that others make our lives worth something. Most people don't realize it because there's something about it, again, that can't be put into words, that's ephemeral, that's like fleeting, that we can push out to the corners of our mind and think about things in a much more rational, self-centered, kind of way. So if there's one thing Judaism is fundamentally trying to do for Rosenzweig, is how do we take that moment of that encounter and try to make it something more permanent? How do we stay true to that encounter in an ongoing fashion? So in Song of Songs, it says famously, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. He browses among the lilies. And the clear line, the important line here is, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. Right? That love binds us to the other, whether we realize it or not. I'll give just one psychoanalytic example of this that I was thinking about. Right? When we lose somebody we love, right, it is profoundly devastating to us. Somebody we really love. And it often feels like our world is becoming undone, right? That we've just lost something that destabilizes everything for us. So as you're probably aware, one of the traditional pieces of the mourning process is that usually at the funeral, at the burial, the Avelim tear a piece of their clothing, and the Kriya. And every time before I would take a mourner through this, I would always say to them that with the loss of your loved one, you have lost a piece of yourself, and that we tear our clothing because clothing is a reflection of who we are as a person. And so by tearing it, it's like a way to concretize the fact that something about us is missing, something about us is broken, something about us is lacking. And I used to say that, and I intuitively thought that was important, but I didn't always understand exactly maybe what that might mean in a deeper sense. But in psychoanalysis, one of the major insights, this goes back to Freud, is that who we are as human beings is fundamentally tied up with our relationships to others, to such an extent that the people we love, we basically take them inside of us. This is the way Freud describes it. They become part of our psyche, part of our ego, this identification with them. So we are the collection of our identification with others, the ones we love in particular. The people we love are the ones we most strongly identify with. So when we lose them, we actually do lose a fundamental piece of ourselves. And so in Song of Songs here it says, I am my beloved and my beloved is mine. That's what it's getting at, that the other in the love encounter and the I thou encounter, it's not just that the other helps make me who I am, right? They forever remain part of me, right? They are always going to be part of me when we love them and they love us. And that is a very, very deep connection. But the problem is, we often don't realize that till they're gone. Right? We have a hard time recognizing love and love's effects on us for all sorts of reasons. And it's exactly why Judaism is trying to stay true to that moment of love, because it, in Rosenzweig and Levinas's language, means staying true to the call of the other, to the real ethical relationship to the other. So Rosenzweig says, he's citing here Shara Shirim, she is his, and she can say too of him, he is mine. Right, that there is this moment of love that binds the two sides to each other. But then Rosenzweig goes on and says, but is she? With names of endearment, the beloved man has clearly intimated his love to her. But is this evocation enough? Meaning there's always some ephemeral moments of love in which you feel, essentially are sort of tied or bound to the other. But it's just this moment, and then it's gone. And what do you do with that? Is it enough just to keep telling the other how much you love them? Doesn't life demand more than the evocation, more than the calling by name? Doesn't it demand reality? And this is the fundamental challenge Rosenzweig is getting at, that love, because it's often wrapped up in a moment and an encounter, right? How do we make it more than that? And for Rosenzweig, love wants to be more than that. Love wants to be something permanent. Love wants to have a permanent foothold in the world. For love is always a matter of between two persons. It knows only the I and you, and it doesn't know the street. Meaning it just knows this sort of love can just take the I and the thou and throw out the rest of the world. But if you look at Shir Shirim, the lovers don't want to be just together in hiding. The two lovers want to be together in the world. The street here, they don't know the street is a reference to the two lovers who want to be in the world, in the street. Right? Love on a certain level wants to be more than a passing moment. It wants to be in the world and connected to the world. That longing cannot be fulfilled then in the love that is revealed in the immediate present of lived experience. Meaning there's something about revelation that is also kind of limiting, because it can only be for a moment, both in eternity and a moment. So how do we make it beyond the moment? How do we make love beyond the moment? Becoming external of love that no longer grows in the I and you. It's no longer limited to this just dialogical I and thou and that's it, but demands to be grounded in view of the entire earth, right? It's a love that wants to be made for, real in reality. And again, we can already imagine what he's talking about here. Marriage is not love. Marriage is infinitely more than love. Marriage is the fulfillment on the outside of love, right? Marriage is the attempt to take love and to make it something enduring and something permanent, right? And when we talk about the Torah as revelation, right, in a certain level, revelation can't be put into words. We've talked about this, right? The I thou is a moment that again exceeds language, right? Because that's what gives it its power. If you could put it in language, it would be just another thing in the world, right? And the fact that it exceeds language is what gives it its transformative power. But at the same time, if it only exceeds language, it's basically totally ephemeral. It has nothing that allows it to endure. And the Torah is as a record of revelation, right? Is an attempt to make love endure, right? To give it language, to give it legs, to give it something, a framework that can extend not just between the I and thou, but outwards beyond it. And of course, you see this very concretely in the rabbinic understanding of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, right? God calls to Abraham the individual. Abraham says yes. But at Mount Sinai, and that's when God falls in love. But at Mount Sinai, it's the attempt to take that love and to make it something real and something more permanent. right? God calls the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. The Jewish people at Mount Sinai say Na'aseh v'nishma. They answer to it. But what the Torah means in that context, again, is not just, okay, revelation happened, right? It's the attempt to take revelation and make it real and ongoing and enduring. And part of the way the Torah does that is through all these laws and mitzvot, right? The rabbis specifically refer to the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai as a ketubah, right? And what the ketubah comes is to define on some level the basic context of the relationship, right? The responsibilities of each side to each other. And again, mitzvot are essential because a relationship means being bound to the other and being commanded by the other. It's a floor, not a ceiling. I mean, you can't, no written document can somehow capture the full dimensions of what does it mean to be in love or how to build a successful relationship. But it's an attempt, right? The Torah is an attempt to be able to do that, to take the I-thou moment and show us what it looks like in shiur shiurim, and at the same time to record revelation and try to give us that historical dimension of revelation. All those times God called to us and we called back. And then there's that third dimension, which is the dimension of mitzvah, of responsibility and obligation, trying to concretize it, but also recognizing that it always exceeds that those concretizations. And the last thing I'll just say, right, if the Torah is God's call to us as Jews, like we know very, very quickly, right, like that you can't be a Jew without God and you can't be a Jew without the Torah. These things are fundamentally, bound to each other. The Zohar goes so far as to even say that God, the Torah, and the Jewish people are one. And it doesn't mean they're obviously literally one, they're not, but what it means is that they are somehow bound and each one is a part of the other in ways that exceed, our ability to easily grasp it. And we're gonna, next time we'll pick up on how the encounter with Torah can actually bring about more of a sense of revelation. I'll just mention now that for Rosenzweig, revelation aesthetically is understood as song. That's of all the aesthetic experience, song comes closest to revelation. Sculpture or painting is creation. Song or music without words is revelation. And then redemption is poetry, which really is music and words that come together. But next time we'll look at how the Torah is maybe understood by Rosenzweig as a song, and how songs have this sort of revelatory ability to sort of hit us, just like the way that a human being can just like hit us, and like we're never quite the same afterwards.